Look what you've made me do. Welcome to my reaction channel. Honestly, this is the last thing I wanted to do in my life, trust me. But since none of you will come to me, I am forced to come to you. As they say, if the mountain won't come to Muhammad, Muhammad will come to the mountain. Please don't kill me. Number 1. Coffee. And lots of it, because they are so dull, boring, and unoriginal. Number 2. Prolonged exposure to pro-Palestinian content can and will lead to the death of brain cells, so we're going to use oxygen and lots of it. Number 3. Like every good Zionist Jew that likes to masquerade himself as a true Semite, I understand I need all the help I can get. My personal advice is IV saline, full of water, electrolytes, and my personal favorite, Semitic blood. Now, since I'm going to watch an interview conducted by Jack Shields and Dave Smith, believe me, I need all the help I can get. So, shall we begin? So, a disclaimer, I did watch this clip a few months ago, and I found it to be very interesting, because it's short, it's to the point, and I need only 7.5 minutes footage of Dave Smith to show what he's really all about. So let's begin.
Right? What it is that all this stuff about that Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager saying, this is all bullshit. This is not what happened. All the slogans, which are very nice and they sound really good, and there's a land without people for a people without land. Like, who could argue with that, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, Dave, this slogan itself was not coined by Zionists. It was coined by European travelers that came to the land, and by their testimonies, indeed, a vast portion of the land was depopulated, empty and desolate. This is historically correct.
Except it's just a bold-faced lie. But right. So essentially what happened is in Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, which was a time of a lot of, say, radical new political theories being worked out, there was this, the early Zionists came out. And so basically Herzl and a bunch of the other guys with it. And
I'm sorry, Dave, but Herzl was not an Eastern European Jew. The early Zionists that predate Herzl did not come to Palestine to form a homeland, a state or a country. My apologies.
Their view was that they wanted to start a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which of course was, you know, where their holy sites are, and according to the holy book. Now, what's kind of interesting here, right, is that these were a bunch of Eastern European atheists.
That's what I always laugh at.
So
I'm sorry to disappoint you, Dave, but the early Zionists of the first Aliyah were not secular and they were not atheists. Most of them were traditional and religious. It is true to say that many of the Jews of the second Aliyah were of a socialist nature. Still, it doesn't make most of them atheists.
Atheists, European descent, saying that was God gave them that land.
now I will say, if you can for a second, however you feel, and I would guess your audience skews to be more critical of Israel than friends of them.
I would think
But,
so.
but I would say, even if as a critic of Israel, you could kind of step back and appreciate that this was a group of poor atheists who had never been to Palestine and wanted to start a country around a religion that they did not believe in, around a language that they did not speak.
While it's true that some of them did not speak Hebrew, many of them have already studied Hebrew in Eastern Europe.
Like, they didn't even speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
They ended up doing it. And there's a lot to that story of how they actually pulled this off, which is pretty amazing.
Wow, a compliment from Dave Smith. Who knew?
A lot of it has to do with getting,
I'll give them that.
well, a lot of it has to do with getting very powerful international Jewish financing
Ah, here we go. International Jewry.
behind it. But this was their goal. And they started to put this plan into action. And the major problem that they had was that there were already people who inhabited the land. They didn't very much care for getting kicked out of their land.
No one kicked them out.
And there were, as the early Zionist settlers started to move in, and they were being more and more brazen about their plans of making this their state, more and more conflict started rising up. Ultimately, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British Empire ended up taking control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. during World War II.
How do you jump timelines so inefficiently? First of all, if you've mentioned the mandate, Dave, you need to state what does the mandate dictates. You didn't.
There had been conflicts this whole time, but during World War II...
Conflicts. Well, Dave, whether you like it or not, during the mandate years from the 1920, 1921, 1929, 1936 to 1939, Jews, for the most part, were the ones getting slaughtered without any shred of defense, while the British stood by and did absolutely nothing. Only during the Arab Revolt, when the Arabs started to target the British themselves, the British started to act.
The British trying to, kind of... They were essentially... The British in World War I committed to facilitating
They made some kind of deal probably for money, right? To give them, but they promised it to both sides.
Well, yeah, they were promising...
No, Mr. Potato Head, the British did not promise Palestine to the Palestinians, and neither in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence that was never signed, but this is a different topic. God, you're such an idiot.
Everyone, everything. They promised Syria Arab independence. They promised Syria to the French. They promised Palestine to the Arabs. They promised it to the Jews. Yeah, they were just trying to raise money. Well, look, and you're in the middle of a world war. You're like, first things first, let's win this war. Then we'll figure out what's up. We'll figure out what's up afterward, right? But so the Balfour Declaration, right, was written by Lord Balfour on behalf of the King of England, was written to the Rothschilds. It wasn't written to anyone in Palestine.
Literally to
it was written to the Rothschilds to go, hey, you finance our war, and we'll sign off on this project that you support.
Well, Dave also misses another fact. Whether he likes it or not, the Arabs of the Levant did not support the Allies nor Britain. They fought alongside the Turks, even if they were oppressed by them. The Jews, on the other hand, supported Britain. A critical point you forgot to mention, Dave.
But there's a lot of resistance from the Arabs who live there, so the British are juggling a lot of different things. They cracked down pretty tough on migration during the run-up to World War II and in World War II, which really pissed the Zionists off there because they saw that, rightfully, as their best opportunity to get people to move to Israel, which was their big project.
Yes, Dave, and it was also the final attempt of Jews to escape Europe after the West have already closed its gates. The white paper basically prevented Jews from escaping Europe before the Holocaust. So yeah, naturally the Zionists were a bit mad, just a tiny bit.
Then the early Zionists, basically, they were run by these like terrorist militia groups. The Irgun, Lehi, Haganah, they were these vicious, very well-financed, very well-trained. So like
I'm sorry, Dave, again, Lehi, not Lehi, and anyone that calls the Haganah a terrorist organization probably didn't spend a lot of time on the issue. They were not well funded, they were not well armed, because during the mandate, the British did everything in their power to prevent them from getting the means to protect themselves, which is why so many Jews were slaughtered in 1920, 1921, 1929, and during the Arab Revolt. It was only during the Second World War, when a German invasion was actually expected from North Africa by Rommel, that the British started to support and train the Haganah, which made them a bit more well-funded, armed, and trained. Jesus Christ.
All those Dennis Prager videos where they're like, all these Arab nations attacked these good little Jewish boys and they beat them all. You know, that's already where like your eyebrows should be raising. Like, wait, how did you beat them all? Well, this is how they...
Well, they were better trained, better armed, a bit, and they had higher morale. You see, this was their only final attempt at survival. If the Jews have lost, they'd be thrown into the sea. While the Arab armies, other than Transjordan, which was funded, armed, and trained by the British, were new. They're not very well trained, and again, lacked the necessary morale.
They beat them all, because they were badass, well-funded, well-trained militias who had embraced terrorism, were committing acts of terrorism to drive...
The Zionist militias only started to use terrorism only after the Arabs for a couple of years have already conducted terrorist attacks, not only against Jewish civilians, but also against the Arab population.
drive out the occupying British, which is like one of the ironies of this whole story that can't be lost.
Something really crazy that's interesting. This was during World War II. So the Britain was fighting Germany for the Jews, and Jews were fighting Britain in Israel.
Okay, let's examine Mr. Potato Head. Britain was fighting Germany on behalf of the Jews, which is why Britain did not cancel the policies of the White Paper during the Second World War, even though most of the Jews sided with Britain. The Irgun and the Haganah, comprising of 99%, Mr. Potato Head, of the Jewish Yeshuv sided with the British, while the majority of the Arabs either stayed neutral or on the fence, or actually wished for a German invasion.
Yeah, how crazy is that? And they say no one came to defend us because they were literally in war with Britain, who was war with Germany at the exact same years. That's so crazy to me.
Well, it is true in a sense that no one came to defend a lot of the Jews who were stranded in Europe, but at the same time...
Why, Dave? Why no one came to defend the Jews in Europe? Perhaps because Britain closed the gates to the British mandate? Perhaps? Slightly?
Right? Then there's this other side of the story. And another interesting little kind of note of history.
Oh, enlighten me, Dave.
Is that the Stern Gang, who was one of those terrorist militia groups in Israel, I believe they met with Nazi officials once, and I think they were trying to work out a partnership with them.
It's funny how Dave mentions the Lehi, or the Stern Gang, but he doesn't mention Haj Amin al-Husseini, he doesn't mention the fact that many of the Arabs sided with the Germans. All he cares about is to prove that the Zionists sided with Germany. And as I've stated, the Haganah and the Irgun, comprising of 99% of the Jewish Yeshuv, sided with the British. It is true to say that during the 1940s, the Stern Gang, the Lehi, led by Avraham Stern, who was a big admirer not of Nazism, but of fascism. He studied in Italy a few years. Did try to contact the Italians, because during this period Stern believed that the Germans were going to win, and he saw the British as the main obstacle, in his eyes, to get the Jews out of Europe via the White Paper, which is why he was willing to make a deal with the devil. It doesn't make him right, it doesn't make him less of a fascist, but again, context, Dave, something you seriously lack.
They liked what Adolf Hitler was talking about. Now, I don't know...
No, Dave, the Zionist Jews did not like Adolf Hitler or Nazi Germany. Jesus fucking Christ.
I don't think they liked what Adolf Hitler did at the end of the war. No. I don't think they were, on board with the genocide. But when Adolf Hitler's plan originally was kick all the Jews out of Europe, the Zionists were like, hell yeah, that's our plan too. Get them all over here.
Well, they even sunk a ship of Jews that were getting left. That's how ruthless these people were. So they would kill Jews too. It was any means possible.
Oh yeah.
You might remember the ship, but they sunk this ship.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
It was getting sent away, and they blew up the ship, and it killed.
Well, Mr. Potato Head and ignorant Dave Smith, I'm assuming they are talking about the Patria disaster. Now again, if Dave Smith was a serious person, he would give some context, but he doesn't even know the name of the ship, so don't expect a lot. So, via the White Paper, during the start of the war, the British were sending refugee ships of Jews coming from Europe back to Europe. Yes. When the gates of Europe were closed and the Germans, via the satellite states, mainly of Romania and the Balkans, prevented the ships from coming back into Europe, the British were in a problem. So they've started to send Jewish refugees to prison camps in the Pacific. And the Patria was going to be used to send almost 2,000 Jewish refugees to Rat. The main issue was that the British declared that any refugee, any Jewish refugee that is going to be on board of the Patria will not be able to come back to the British mandate legally, which is why some geniuses in the Haganah, which of course were very well trained, were very well armed, as Dave Smith put it, conducted a plan to sabotage the ship to prevent it from laying anchor and traveling to the Pacific. But some of them botched it, placed a bigger charge than they should have been, which led to the sinking of the ship and to 250 refugees drowning. Now, most of the refugees survived and were allowed to remain. But it's funny that Mr. Potato Head and Dave Smith mentioned the Patria, but they don't mention any other ship. They don't mention something like the Stroma, which was a ship that had to lay anchor in Turkey and was not allowed, because of the British, to set foot in Palestine, which is why the Turks, that were neutral during the war, did not want to let any of the refugees into their land, so they sent it back. And the ship was actually torpedoed by, probably, a Soviet submarine. Most of the refugees died other than one individual. So more Jewish refugees died on top of the Stroma than on the Patria. But of course, why mention this? Why mention any context, Dave?
A couple hundred Jews.
Yeah, they were like real hardcore guys.
Yeah, they bombed the King David.
Hardcore. Again, in the eyes of Dave Smith, in the eyes of traditional anti-Semitism, the Jew is the ultimate evil, which means everything he does is calculated, sinister, with maliciousness. Nothing they can do will ever be an error, a mistake, a miscalculation. Everything has to be according to a devilish plan. Interesting, Dave. Tells me all I need about you.
Hotel killing.
Yes, they killed. Yeah, killed a bunch, including
British,
Jews and a bunch of British. Yeah.
And again, we are jumping to 1946 to the King David Hotel. Oh, my fucking God.
So then, essentially by 1947, right? So this is after King David, all the terrorists and all that shit. The British basically just throw up their arms and they're like, dude, the empire's crumbling after World War II. They're done. They kick it over to the UN. It had just been created. And they throw it to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, after a lot of, let's just say a lot of unethical persuading.
Bribery.
Yeah. A mix of bribery and threats.
Yeah,
you know?
killing a lot of people too.
Yeah. So a mix of both of them.
Again, you make a statement without any kind of credible source.
They didn't have the votes, but they ended up bribing / threatening their way to getting the votes, even though no one within hundreds of miles of Palestine voted for it. Like it was all like European and powers and stuff. But so they vote to recommend, which is just a recommendation because the General Assembly has no authority to create nations.
Look at you, Dave.
So they voted to recommend that the Jews get 56% or something like that of the land, and the Arabs get the 44%. And the Arabs rejected it immediately because the Jews were a minority of the population there. They didn't own the majority of the land. Like there was no justification for it.
Again, Dave forgets to mention that whether he likes it or not, modern-day Jordan constitute the majority of the landmass of Palestine, and it was given to the Arabs already during the 1920s. So it's incorrect to say that most of the land of the British Mandate was designated to the Jews. Most of the land designated in the partition plan was the Negev Desert, which was a desert. So again, Dave, context. You cannot throw numbers and facts without giving some kind of credibility. And stating that the Jews, most of them did not own most of the land, is correct, but neither were the Arabs. Most of the land during the British Mandate was state-owned. And whether you like it or not, you cannot come to the Jews and say you didn't own enough land. If you forget, the white paper, that you didn't mention, of course, forbade Jews from acquiring land in 95% of the landmass of the British Mandate. So how can Jews own more land if you don't allow them by law to purchase it, Dave? Interesting. Not apartheid. No, not at all.
And then, essentially, conflict started breaking out right away.
The Arabs rejected the partition plan, and the next day started slaughtering Jews, Dave. Again, conflict started. Every conflict starts without anyone actually initiating it, unless it's the Jews.
It was like fighting in the streets.
Fighting in the street, just a brawl, neighbors fighting each other.
It escalated and escalated. The Jewish Zionist terrorist militias went around committing atrocities, forcing people out of their homes. And in the end, somewhere in the ballpark of 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes and never allowed to return. And so this is what...
Again, Dave, rejecting the partition plan, starting a civil war, stating that they are going to commit an active genocide, getting the aid of the nearby Arab states to commit it, and sadly, paying the price for the mistakes of not only their leadership, but the leadership of the Arab states that have used them as scapegoats in order to slaughter the Jews. Yes, they paid a price. It's very tragic. But of course, Dave Smith is not going to mention any Jewish refugees, not only from the Arab and Islamic world, but 10% of the population inside of the British Mandate of the Jews also became refugees. But Dave doesn't care. He doesn't give a shit. And I don't think he really gives a shit about Arab refugees either.
Created the refugee crisis to begin with.
Ah, Jesus fucking Christ.